Thank you very much. As the others, I would also like to say thank you for the invitation. I'm grateful that I'm having the opportunity to talk to you. I am a political scientist working on Islam in different regions of the world, mainly in the non-Arab world, with a particular focus on Islam in South Asia, but also its European implications. And in this connection, I was involved in a particular research group that was called Muslims in Europe, and that existed between 2006 and 2010 at the Center for Modern Oriental Studies in Berlin, a research center which primarily focuses on lives and societies in Asia and Africa, with a strong emphasis on Muslim societies. And the reason we came to look at Europe in this connection was that many of the Muslims who have originally come from South Asia, but also from other regions of the Middle East and Africa, they are now having a strong impact in Europe itself. And the question was that we were asking ourselves, what are religious groups of Islam doing in Western Europe seemingly differently as to their countries of origin? And how does that difference relate to norms prevalent in Europe, but not limited to it? And within this group, we had a number of subgroups, a number of sub-projects devoted to particular groups, actors, institutions, showing and exploring the diversity of Muslim lives. In this connection, what was important for us, and what actually is also important for me as a supervisor of PhD projects at the Freie Universität Graduate School of Muslim Cultures and Societies, to reduce the identity of Muslims not only to their religious understanding, because what we see in their lives is that we have to see the concurrent behavior as people affiliated, associated, tied to a particular religion, but also as social beings. And there is a strong connection to their cultures of origin. There's a strong connection to their social lives. And we see that a lot of these groups play out, and a lot of these networks play out as identity politics. In fact, in the current age, at the current time, where we see an upsurge of identity politics, we should be able perhaps to better also understand the drivers and the structures that lead to Muslim groups, networks, practices playing out not just in religious formats, but also in other formats, in cultural formats, in political formats, in social formats, because we are dealing with a situation of migratory and compository background of society where these elements play a strong role. Just to give you a brief idea of what we were looking at that particular research group, which gave us a better understanding of the diversity of Islam in Europe, were the missionary movements of the Tablighi Jamaat and the Dawat-e Islami, and the Ahmadiyya, the sectarian movement, which is primarily also driven by missionary incentives. Then the gender discourses in the Turkish Islamic organization Milli Görüş, which was briefly mentioned in the beginning in connection with the larger ideological discourses of the Muslim Brotherhood. The same applies to the Islamic Federation in France, which nowadays, since 2017, has been renamed as the Musulmans de France. The Islamic Training Institutes in Germany, and that Interreligiöses Institut für Pädagogik und Didaktik institutions where Muslims offer, and it is very interesting, in particular also women activists offer their own understanding of Islam, how that reconciles with society, how that reconciles with social lives. We are talking about Muslim schools in Britain, the Netherlands, which were then compared with Muslim schools in South Africa. The ways in which they operate and in which they ascertain themselves in Europe show overall a great diversity. And we have come to understand that the distinctions between the way and the level to what they integrate in society are not necessarily and not always depending on the particular orientation in Islam, but are very often dependent on the society in which they operate. For instance, to give an example about the groups mentioned as connected with the Muslim Brotherhood, but also with Salafi organizations, there's much more evidence of tension and conflict, for instance, in the context of France than, let's say, in the context of Britain. And political scientists taking a look somewhat from outside argue that for that is also responsible the way the particular society, the particular social and political setup deals with these diversities. For instance, in Britain, we see that Muslim institutions, Muslim schools are partly or fully integrated into state and public sponsored systems where they are also checked and controlled while at the same time getting funding and support, where, for instance, religious schools, madrasas are included in the public education system in Britain to the extent where they offer particular degrees or sub-degrees, whereas in France, for instance, we see that this integration has been very difficult or not been possible or partly confrontational, which again political scientists and analysts argue has also to do with the understanding of society and of secularism. There is, for instance, a deep distinction between the way the term secularism itself is interpreted. In France, the laïcité concept is very much based on us versus them, which means it's a sort of a segregation, even a separation to a large extent, meaning to say laïcité means definitely non-religious, whereas secularism in the British context, and more so in some society, let's say, that have been under British colonial rule, for instance, in India, secularism can go to the point and to the extent where it is inclusive of everyone, where even in India, for instance, under Gandhi and Nehru, secularism was conceptualized to pointedly include mutual tolerance of different religions, of different beliefs, and of different concepts of society. And this shows itself also in the way how these Muslim groups and institutions operate in Europe, that there are quite a lot of differences in the way they operate in different parts of Europe for the same organization, if only dependent on the context in which they operate. For instance, here we see the European Center of the Tabligh Jamaat, the missionary movement in Britain, which operates, so to say, quite freely and independently and self-understood. And there is a madrasa in Britain, in Holcombe, which is connected with the orientation of this particular missionary movement. But then when we come to France, we see quite diverse social, how to say, imprints on their mode of operation. For instance, their center in Paris is, in a sense, confined to a suburb in Saint-Denis, where primarily Muslims of direct migrant origin go, and to the point and to the extent where that particular madrasa is even afraid or scared of putting a signboard outside the building that it is here a mosque which is operating. Here you see the followers, how they also entered the mosque, preparing the mosque, where in contrast, in Marseille, you have a different social profile of Muslim migration, where you have sub-societies of traders, of people who are established, leading their own life, and where they even have managed to establish contact with local politics to build their own mosque and collect the money from the local society. So a very different social profile, both connected with politics, connecting with local traders, and being also accepted and respected, and not being shy also to put the plate outside what they actually are and what they actually are doing. And that's particularly important because it also shows the differences in what way Islam or Muslims can be political. Political in the European context means, in the sense, it starts at the level of local society with civic engagement, meaning to say reaching out into the public, reaching out into society, understanding your community as part of the society. That's why it is very important for a lot of Muslim communities in Europe to offer also social services to community members, where, interestingly enough, increasingly, and again depending on the country about which we are talking, a growing number of women are offering services, not on the level of imam, but on other levels in terms of teaching students, in terms of teaching kids, in terms of running particular administrative services for the mosque community, etc. So that, as in many Muslim families, which one knows from Muslim countries, despite the very still strongly operating patriarchal system, it is very often women in the background taking the decisions. And that is, again, being also felt and making more visible in the European context. So the Muslims who arrived in Europe, they were arriving in different ways and for different reasons. We are not even talking today about, so to say, and regions which are often ignored when we are talking about Islam in Europe, historical parts of Europe, in Bosnia, in Russia, etc., who have been here for a very long time and have been here historically present. We are also not even talking about the historical traditions that have been almost forgotten when on today's territory of Spain a Muslim rule was existing, and when around the 10th century, 11th century, Arabic was an intellectual lingua franca also for philosophy and for politics, and where Muslim intellectuals, in a sense, saved the heritage of Greek language knowledge and books which were translated into Arabic. So we are talking about a time period when Muslims came here with primarily migrational trends, which is, that one has to remember, only one of several ways in which Europe was and is connected with Islam. There is an element which is from the religious background important, that is, so to say, their existence as a minority community or which follows a particular system of rules, the fiqh al-aqaliyat, which has a particular meaning, why it means, and in spite of other political and ideological utterings of Qaradawi, he is also responsible for this minority law regime being prominent and largely accepted also by conservative Muslims in Europe. That is, that you have to submit yourself to the rule of the country. And that is the basic rule, which is directly derived also from Quran. And it is important transformation, as far as people from Islamic studies argue, that this has been, over the years, the last 20, 30 years, been very much formalized and has been accepted and structured in a way it was not done before. So there is definitely also a change and a transformation for people who believe that they would and can act as believers and reconcile this identity with European identity. What is also important and often ignored in the European context is that Islam, in effect, in its inner religious debates, offers a lot of reasons and arguments for doing so. Why? Because as compared to the other Abrahamic religions, but also as compared to other world religions, Islam had a particular element of distinction, and that is its founder was also a head of government. And there is a particular document of governance, the Constitution of Medina, which is perhaps the only secular document we know done or made or authored by the founder of a particular religion, where directly elements are negotiated of governance, of living with other parts of society, including with the Jews. Because we should not forget that the current controversy, which is ideologically very much loaded with Israel, is, historically speaking, a very new, very recent phenomenon of, so to speak, modernity, because before the 18th century, there was primarily a lot of cooperation and even cultural overlap between these systems. So these minority living conditions from a religious perspective required religious authority, as they argue, so to speak, what is right and wrong for a Muslim to do in the European context, and that has been increasingly regulated. And at the same time, we should not forget that Islam and Islam in Europe as well has a lot of diversity from a sectarian perspective. For instance, all major sectarian orientations are represented: the Sunni, the Shia, the Salafi, the heterodox sects of the Ahmadiyya and the Alawi. The Sunni, for instance, they are based, as we know, on the 4 law schools and the principles as enshrined in the Quran and the prophetic tradition. Not to forget the practice-based Sufi in themselves, revering prominent clerics, holy men as sheikhs. Here, for instance, while the media and politics very often focus on particular Salafi or modernist or Islamist elements of expression, we did not notice or tend to forget that even Sunni perspectives have found a lot of practice and followers. For instance, giving here the example of a particular Sufi shrine in Birmingham, where there was a burial of Sufi Muhammad Abdullah Khan, who came to Britain to help organize Muslims worship among thousands of new arrivals from the South Asian subcontinent. And in the corner you see his grave. I mean, you see the mass following, and it is a competition and at the same time a different way of culture practicing daily life in that connection. About the Muslim Brotherhood, we have already heard from the political and the ideological perspective. I mentioned that there is a reason why Islam in politics has found a lot of arguments. One reason was, as I mentioned, the original traits of governance, and that in the Quran itself, a large number of principles are directly referring to administrative issues, how to deal with particular issues in a particular context. The other is, of course, the appearance of modernity and nationalism, where in countries which by colonial powers had been occupied and where nationalism could not easily grow as an identity reference, because many of the colonies actually captured different ethnic communities, different language communities. So it was not easy to develop a single nationalist reference, as was the case in Europe under the French, the Spanish, the German linguistic dominance, even though that was also not a given, because all language areas were covering more than one country. But this was more so the case in the colonial regions, and therefore the religious references served as nationalist propellers and identity propellers for many communities. And that not only applied to Islam. In the subcontinent, for instance, in South Asia, we see the same applied to Hindu nationalism, which did not exist before. And now we have a government in India which is operating in its name. It also applied to the Sikh community self-understanding. But even Buddhism, in the sense as it later inspired other regions and other governments, primarily came into a political focus during this period of anti-colonial identity politics. So we have heard about the different aspects of the Muslim Brotherhood, what researchers emphasize, and I just wanted to also share that here, is that they argue it should not necessarily easily be summarized under one headline, because there is a lot of differentiation in the system, as in any of the other groups and systems in Islam. For instance, that the original groups are primarily focused on the Mashriq, that is the eastern part of the Middle East, where the original movements were operating, whereas the strongest base in Europe, the directest base, is in France, and those organizations, their primary focus of supporters is in the Maghreb, in the western parts of the North African states. We have a similar diversity of Salafis. It is not easy to summarize them under just one headline. The Salafi groups and mosques of younger people in Europe are often attracting young people who want to distinguish themselves from the cultural traits of Islam of their parents, which is not the same as the culture and rules of the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, which again is not the same as another Salafi system, the Al-Hadith, which rejects all law schools and wants to return to the very original principles of the Quran without any interference of the law schools. So again, we have already three different elements, and they all call themselves Salafi, and it is very important in our perspective to make such distinctions to not come to different conclusions. So I think the time limit does not allow to go too much into the details of these differentiations here, but just to end more or less on this, how they adapted to the European structures of society. So they approached Europe through a legal framework, they operated through the media, they interacted with the welfare state and social reality, and also with competitive politics. A similar dynamics developed in connection with European values, where we have different levels, different elements of engagement depending on the country and on the subject. So what I wanted to conclude it here with is there was a summarization of the influence that Europe could have by and relevance for religious plurality is that in the Western, that lies in the Western legal tradition legalizing religious plurality, that modernization is a coexistence between theological and secular underpinnings of society, and that secularization could also be a separation of state and religion, which in itself provides space for religious social activism. Leaving it on that, to discuss the variety, you're welcome to ask your questions. Thank you. Because different governments in Europe take different perspectives. Even in Germany, the one president said Islam is part of Europe. The other said Muslims are, Islam is not, which is the expression of a particular ideological and political perspective. What I said is that Islam and Europe has a threefold history, and all the elements are there, and we are dealing with all the elements. I mean, we have been dealing with the element in Bosnia, the issue in Chechnya is there, the question is there how Islam is, the integration is happening in France. So even if for political and ideological reasons politicians refuse to accept the interconnection between Islam and Europe, nevertheless they are forced to deal with it. And increasingly, fortunately, young Muslim activists are becoming part of this interpretation and are becoming part of this engagement. In Germany, you are finding now young Muslim politicians in the Green Party, in the Left Party, in the CDU, in every party they are. And there are also migrants who are supporting the AfD for ideological and political reasons, because identity politics cut across European societies and across the European states. Therefore, the interaction between Muslims and politics is now happening on all ideological and political levels. I hope that this is not a source of conflict, but an inspiration of transformation, because we could see, let's put it that way, the positive effect of this slow transformation also in Germany itself. You know that there is a status for the state dealing with Christian communities based on particular treaties in the early century. Then we know that in Austria there had been a separate treaty with the Muslim community at large. Now Germany understood and has started to develop a treaty framework on state levels. Several states in Germany have already concluded agreements. Currently, they are, as far as I understand, being put on hold because of the tension with Turkey primarily. But again, this tension with Turkey is another complicated issue, because Germany itself was a partner to this tension, who gave to Turkey the right to monopolized the position of imams, it was Germany. And that's why we see that this transformation process is slow, but it continues. And it currently, what I can see, is slightly shifting, which is not bad at all, to a higher level of visibility of young Muslim activists and politicians in all the political parties.
We are speaking today about political Islam and Europe. According to the definition of the Council of Europe, Russia is also part of Europe. I will later speak mainly on the European Union. But you have experience from Russia. What could you say about that? I think there is a very large number of Muslims in Russia. It was a much bigger number as long as it was Soviet Union, of course. But even now, what could you say about the relations there?
I mean, you had in Russia and in the whole post-Soviet states the state muftiyat system. And it is often reduced to a Soviet or Stalinist intervention. The reality is much more complicated. These muftiyats existed even before communism came to power under the Tsar. So there is another, political tradition continuity. Then under Stalinism there was an up and down, there was a ban, and then suddenly there was a reversal of the ban in the Second World War when Muslims were sought after as allies. But the structure continued, and in a sense this structure is today also trying to ease tensions. And Russia is facing similar challenges as the rest of Europe in terms of migration, because there is a huge number of working migrants of Muslim origin in Russia. For Tajikistan, where I was during my research, and I saw it from the other perspective, it is half of their product of the economy is coming from these migrants, 50%. So it is an existential issue for them. So so Russia is limited in its options to either confront it or not. But in a sense, one could argue the muftiyat system helps to regulate these issues, even though it does not prevent the existence of very similar differentiations as in the rest of the world and in other parts of Europe, with the exception of Chechnya, where a particular power, war, corruption kind of configuration developed that was put down by force.
And what is muftiyat?
Muftiyat means it's a state administration which is regulating the mosques and the religious seminaries. It's in a sense similar as in Turkey.
But somehow in close connection to Moscow.
No, that's not that easy. It's more complicated. I mean, they have a certain level. After the Soviet system ended, they gained a certain level of independence. At the same time, it is clear that their representatives cannot operate without talking or coordinating with the state, the KGB follow-up institutions, or any of the other institutions. But on a daily level, on a local level, they have gained a certain level of independence administratively. I think there is no single answer to that, because we see both trends. For instance, in Berlin, we have this very radical project of the Ibn Rushd Mosque, which is run by women who are publicly operating as imams. And in a sense, I would compare it to trends of activism that are international. In a sense, it is somehow nowadays connecting to, as Black Lives Matter, so women lives matter, Muslim lives matter. I mean, these sort of claims for dealing with injustices of society have become globalized, and therefore particular projects in one country will find imitations in another country, and so do the opposite trends as well. We see a global proliferation also of the right-wing populists, and the digital media, as we all know, help in both sides and directions. Tajikistan primarily, I mean, from the poorer, I'm speaking about the post-Soviet space. The poorer the former post-Soviet state in its own economy is, the higher, so to speak, in economic political terms, is the migration. The countries which are economically better off, like Kazakhstan, with their own income from oil exploration, is much less. Kyrgyzstan is somewhere in the middle. Turkmenistan has the advantage of a lot of income also from gas. So Tajikistan is definitely one crucial source of migration, but I think Uzbekistan is also quite strongly represented. I think since we are talking about your cultural diplomacy, diplomacy is about talking to the adversary, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if we are deciding to make treaties, I mean, the objective is to implicate, to have participation, to have exchange, to have commitments, so that also the important standard remains, that is observing and following the laws and rules of the land. And a formal treaty, a formal engagement with Muslim communities is another, so to say, stepstone for formalizing such arrangements, for also creating commitments and turning them into a binding force beyond a social or a cultural commitment, accepting, so to say, the guest status and honoring the guest country, formalizing it into legal formats. And then therefore I think it is important to do so. It is important to keep them transparent and to keep the whole process transparent, so to engage people in this process.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think time is passing. We have to break there. Thank you so much.
I would like to ask you, you are giving a presentation here, just like a question, very quick question, about the Muslim Brotherhood. They are using Islam as a tool to show that, to market themselves that they are representing Islam, which is, you know, we have in Islam different sects, different even ideologies, or different adoption to the ideas of Muslim. But Muslim Brotherhood, they represent, or they market themselves as they are representing the entire Islam. It's very dangerous. Some people, they think. So what do you think about how to combat such like marketing?
Okay.
How to combat such marketing for Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, as I tried to say also in my presentation, I think it is, from an analytical point of view, not easy to reduce the Muslim Brotherhood to just one entity. So I think one has to distinguish between different organizations and between certain conceptual approaches. I think the conceptual approaches, one has to make clear what one stands for and what one is against. Principles like what in Europe we call the rule of law, and the demands or expectations of society. And I think it is much more useful to achieve clarification on these rules on which people want to live, and then measure the different organizations that come up against such rules. Because reducing them on one denominator will actually only help the extremists. So it is much more reliable to formulate policies and concepts which one wants to defend.
European decision makers, they have to take kind of procedures to combat such, or they are a little bit flexible toward this expansion of their power in Europe?
I think that's precisely the reason why I said so, because Europe, the distinction of Europe and the character of Europe is precisely that we are sharing particular rules of life and particular rules of society. And I think the best way to go against extremist tendencies is to defend these rules. And therefore it is depending on the politicians, on political parties, on civil society activists to become active in defending those rules and to make clear that certain or particular types of behavior are unacceptable, and we are preferring, or we want to defend our life according to the rules that Europe is living on. I think that is the preferable way where Europe can defend its principles rather than going against particular names, denominators, or particular organizations. As you said yourself, they can also change their identity, they can change their nature, they can change their character. So what we can really defend is the way we live in Europe. That is what we can defend.
Thank you.